Okay, now let's talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. So there are two major literary achievements of Mesopotamia. The first is the Enuma Elish. The second is something called the Epic of Gilgamesh. As you can see, Gilgamesh, he is a giant human. He's a king. He's considered the first king of Uruk, okay? And he's so big that a lion is his pet. Okay? What happens is that Gilgamesh is a king, but he's a tyrant. So he takes the men to war and he sleeps with all the women. So the people cry to the gods for relief from Gilgamesh. So the gods create Enkidu from clay, okay? And this is very similar to the story of Adam in the Bible. And Enkidu is like an animal. But then Gilgamesh sends a prostitute to seduce him and then becomes civilized, okay? And now Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight, and when they fight, they realize that they can't beat each other, so they decide to become best friends. They're best friends now, and they embark on all these adventures together. They go kill these divine beings. They go kill the protector of the forest. They kill a divine bull. The gods are now kind of pissed at them because they're disrupting the natural order, okay? So the gods have a meeting. They decide that one of them must die. So they kill Enkidu. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is heartbroken. And he's scared because he's afraid that he will die as well. So he sets on a quest for immortality, okay? He goes and tries to figure out how to live forever. He ultimately fails, okay? And it ends with Gilgamesh returning home, and he sees happiness in the walled cities, in his people being happy, okay? So the moral of the story is that immortality is not about living forever. Immortality is about doing great things for your people so that you'll be remembered forever, celebrate forever. So the irony is that even though Gilgamesh failed in his quest, he ultimately succeeded in his mission because we have his epic, and so we're able to celebrate him even today. Okay, so it's a story that is being told. The question now is, why is this story being told? And one theory is that this is a concept of kingship. Being a king means not doing whatever you want. Being a king means to serve the people so that people will celebrate you and remember you forever and immortalize you in writing. Okay? That's a theory. All right, but ultimately Gilgamesh is a bureaucratic creation. And I'm going to explain to you how this creation works. Through this creation process, we can understand how human society develops over time. So in the beginning, what happens is that each region has local legends, okay? And these local heroes are celebrated through stories. So stories of demigods like Hercules, right? And the epic heroism. They have these stories because each region has a local king. And this local king says, well, I'm a descendant of Hercules, and therefore I should rule over you, okay? And what will happen is that these stories become a test for the king. If Hercules can fight a lion, then you are his ancestor, descendant, right? You are his descendant, therefore you should go fight a lion, okay? And that's how you justify your kingship, through these acts of heroism that's relayed to you in stories, okay? That's the first step. Second step is what happens is that as these different areas become consolidated into a much larger area, these stories themselves become consolidated. So Gilgamesh was basically different heroes. One king comes to dominate a region. Then what happens afterwards is that as the region becomes larger and larger, you need a bureaucracy. So bureaucratic priests come into power, they add in morality and messaging to control the people and the king. Okay, the major message is the king must serve the people, and then the priests control the king. But what will happen is that these different bureaucratic factions will fight each other, and they will have different versions of the story, okay? So bureaucratic priests take power, the morality and messaging changes, okay? As different bureaucratic priests take power, okay? The king must learn humility. So this is a hard thing to understand, but it's really important for us to understand, otherwise you cannot understand the Bible and other literary creations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example to help you better understand this process of storytelling. All right, so let's imagine three universities, Ohio State University, Connecticut, and Middlebury. and they all have their own local legends, okay? So in these places, something happened that captured the imagination of all the students. So maybe at Ohio State University, Michael James gets drunk the night before examination, and he still manages to pass it. And the students are like, that's a great story, okay? But what happens over time is that because it's just a great story, as the story is told more and more, it becomes exaggerated. Why? Because it becomes exaggerated, it's much more interesting, it's become much more memorable, okay? And over time, people add color to it to make it even more memorable. If you don't do that, the story becomes forgotten, okay? So the only way to keep a story alive is by constantly exaggerating it and bringing color to it. So let's see what happens. Over time, the story becomes Michael James gets drunk before every examination and he scores 100, okay? That's an exaggeration. And then, over time, naturally, through the oral tradition, the story becomes even more exaggerated. Michael James bet his professor that he could get 100 on the exam while drunk. After James finished the exam, he vomited on the professor. He threw up on the professor. The professor could not do anything because James had got 100 on the exam. Okay? All right? So human beings just do this naturally. If something happens, they think it's interesting, then it becomes a legend, it becomes a story, okay? And this happens everywhere. So Connecticut College, a football player scores a winning touchdown, okay? And then it becomes exaggerated. The guy scores touchdown every game, and then even more exaggerated, the guy hits a home run to help his team win the championship, and then later that day, he scores a touchdown to win another, okay? So it becomes more exaggerated. And then let's look at the last one. At Middlebury College, Pat Jack drives to Canada to take a piss, okay? He just does that for no reason. Becomes more exaggerated. He goes to a new city every day to take a piss, okay? And then it becomes even more exaggerated. And now you add color and detail to it. Pat Jack drove to Canada and accidentally pissed on a sleeping bear, okay? He ran up a tree without his pants and forest rangers had to come rescue him. Okay? All right? So this is what happens naturally. The story becomes funnier, the story becomes more colorful, more detailed, more exaggerated, so that we're able to remember it, okay? And then over time, what happens is that these stories become consolidated, combined together to form a new story, okay? Harvard's most legendary student was Pitbull James. He once wrote an exam that no professor could pass. He once hit a home run with one arm. He once pissed on a sleeping bear just so he could knock down the bear with one punch, okay? So it becomes even more exaggerated, it becomes consolidated. Just as the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? But then what happens is the bureaucrats take over. Okay? The people in charge take over, and they have to change the story in order to better control people. And there are different versions of this process. So let's look at 3. All right, you add just one line and you change the story, right? In the first version, when he became a billionaire, he gave it all to Harvard, okay? So obviously Harvard wrote this story to say, you know what, we don't care what you do as long as you give us money, okay? That's the first version. Second version is, when he wrote he found his true love, he settled down in the woods to write full time, okay? So this is signaling the primacy of writers over athletes, okay? The smart over the brave. And the third is the bear ate him, okay? So he punched the bear and the bear decides to eat him, which is like, don't be a stupid athlete. Okay? And so when you add these actually lines, you make the story less interesting, less colorful. But you do so in order to better control how people think. And this is a process that we see throughout human history. So think of these classics, of these Chinese classics, right? 三国演义, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. COG, right? Journey to the West. 水浒传, right? Bandits of the Water Margin. If you read them, they're not that interesting. But before, you can imagine that they were interesting. But the bureaucrats took them and changed them into boring stories that they can now teach school children to brainwash them. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a process of civilization. All right, so another example is Hesiod's Theogony. And he's talking about Greek mythology, okay? Greek religion. So the process goes like this. At first, Gaia, who's like the mother goddess, and Chaos, they give birth to the gods. Gaia marries one of these gods, Uranus, okay? And they give birth together to 12 titans. But Uranus doesn't really like children, So he beats up his children. So these children, with help from the mother, decides to rebel against Uranus. The youngest son, Cronus, kills Uranus. Okay? Then Uranus marries Rhea, and now Cronus is king, but he's afraid that his children will eventually rebel against him, just like he rebelled against his father. Therefore, he eats all his children. Rhea, the mother, is upset about this, so she decides, I'm going to give birth to Zeus in secret. So she runs off to an island, and she gives birth to him in secret, and he leaves Zeus there to grow up, okay? Eventually, he grows up, and then he goes back to Cronus. He becomes cupbearer to Cronus, and then poisons him, okay? And that's how Zeus becomes the ultimate king. What's really interesting for our purposes is that this myth influences the origin story of major historical figures, okay? So if you look at these major historical figures, you will find that it's a very similar story. So Sargon of Akkad, who founded the Akkadian Empire, Romulus and Remus, who founded Rome, King David, who founded Israel, and Genghis Khan of the Mongols, okay? They all share this similar origin story. So where do we get this origin story from? Okay, so going back, we're seeing three layers, right? So the first layer is the original layer, which is the animistic layer, okay? So different gods come together and they create humans. The second layer is when Cronus rebels against Uranus and establishes the kingship, okay? Right? The third layer is this. The third layer is the most interesting. Usually when you're king, you need a general. And what often happens is that the king likes to hire a foreign mercenary to be a general. Why? Because first of all, he's of low birth, right? Therefore, no legitimacy. Second, he's a foreigner, and therefore he doesn't have any political factions behind him. But often what happens is that this foreign mercenary is so talented that he's able to build a political faction to overthrow the king and become king himself, because he's really talented. This is true for Genghis Khan, this is true for King David of Israel, this is true for Sargon of Akkad, okay? So there are lots of historical figures like that. Even in Chinese history, you have quite a few historical figures like this as well. So the founder of the Song dynasty was this sort of person. The problem though is that once he becomes king, he has a legitimacy problem. He's of low birth, he's a foreigner, right? So what do? You create a myth of Zeus, right? That Zeus himself was of low birth and a foreigner, but not really, because he's a secret son of the king, okay? And that's why you have these stories. To legitimize the king. All right, so again, this follows the dynastic cycle, okay? So in the beginning, the high priestess, who represents the mother goddess, she has a consort. And so they establish a hereditary elite. But this hereditary elite makes people unhappy with the system. So then one prince or one of the sons decides, you know what, I'm going to form my own political faction. I'm going to become a warlord. I'm going to overthrow the queen and the king, okay? And so he slays the consort and marries the high priestess, okay, which is following the pattern of the mythology, right? Then what happens is that after the warlord dies, his son relies on a mercenary as general. The mercenary is often a foreigner and of low birth. Mercenary slays the warlord and makes himself king, okay? Okay? Does that make sense? This is a pattern that we see over and over in history, and this explains why the myths are constructed the way they are. Okay, so another way, a metaphor that we can use is think of myths and stories as like house renovation, okay? So when you renovate a house, you're adding different layers to it. Okay? That's literally what's happening. Okay, so we will look at one last story to show you how this writing process works. Remember, they invented writing in order to basically gaslight the people. So even though Sumeria, Mesopotamia, is developing really quickly, as you can see from this map, it's still a very diverse place, okay? They have different forms of industry and economy. So maybe in the green, you have agriculture, but in the red, it's pastoral, meaning you're raising animals, sheep, goats, you're going all over the place, okay? So there are two different types of agriculture. The first form is you are sedentary. You just stay in one place and you grow your food. You you grow your crops, you grow your plants. The second is pastoral, where you're going around and you are feeding your sheep and your goats, okay? If you're a king, or if you're a priest, if you're a bureaucrat, do you prefer agricultural people or pastoral people? Obviously agriculture. Why? Because it's easier to control them, okay? So what they do now is, they're going to create these mythologies to convince people to give up the free, happy lifestyle of a pastoralist and become an enslaved farmer, okay? All right? And the question is how? Well, this is how. This is called the debate between the sheep and the grain, okay? So the sheep and the grain have this debate and they appear before the gods for judgment. The sheep says, I'm the better one. The grain says, no, I'm the better one, okay? So that's this debate. The sheep says this, and King of the gods, make me descend from the holy place, my most precious place. All the yarns about Otu, the splendor of kingship, belong to me. Second, king of the mountain embosses the king's emblems and puts his implements in order. He twists a giant rope against the great peaks of the rebel land, he the sling, the quiver, and the long bows. The watch over the elite troops is mine. Sustenance of the workers in the field is mine. The water skin of cool water and the sandals are mine. Sweet oil, the fragrance of the gods, mixed oil, pressed oil, aromatic oil, cedar oil for offerings are mine, okay? So I'm the sheep. Look how great I am, okay? I provide clothing for people. I provide sandals. I have oil, which makes people more fragrant. I also provide food for your soldiers. So I'm great. In the gown, my cloth of white wool, the king rejoices on his throne. My clothing is worn by the king himself. Isn't that proof that I'm the greatest? My body glistens on the flesh of the great gods. After purification priests, the incarnation priests, and the bathe priests have dressed themselves in me for my holy lustration. I walk with them to my holy meal. Okay? So the priests, when they make sacrifices, they sacrifice the sheep. The priests are not going to sacrifice grain, they sacrifice sheep, okay? But your hero, plowshare binding, and sharps are tools that can be utterly destroyed. What can you put against me? And answer me what you can reply, okay? So that's the argument from the sheep. The grain says, when the beer dough has been carefully prepared in the oven and the mash tended in the oven, Nikasha mixes them for me while your big bully goats and rams are dispatched for my banquets. On the thick legs they are made to stand separate from my produce. Your shepherd on the high plain eyes my produce enviously. When I am standing in a furrow in the field, my farmer chases away your herdsman with his cudgel. Even when they look out for you from the open country to the hidden places, your fears are not removed from you. Fang snakes and bandits, the creatures of the desert, want your life on the high plain. Every night your count is made and your tally stick put into ground, so your herdsman can tell people how many ewes there are and how many young lambs and how many goats and how many young kids. When gentle winds blow through the city and strong winds scatter, they build a milking pen for you. But when gentle winds blow through the city and strong winds scatter, I stand up as a equal to Iskar. I am grain, I am born for the warrior. I do not give up the churn, the vat on legs, the endowments of shepherding. Make up your properties. What can you put against me? Answer me what you can reply, okay? Well, what grain says is, first of all, you don't need to protect me. I can protect myself. There are no animals that want to eat me. Okay? And I'm bountiful, okay? So I'm independent. You do less work, you get more of me. Okay? That's the argument. And of course, the gods say that grain is better. Even though people who raise sheep and goats, they're stronger, they're more free, they're more independent. But kings don't want that. So they create these stories, these mythologies, in order to brainwash people out of their freedom, out of their independence. Okay? And that's why we have writing. That's why they invented writing. Okay? Does that make sense to you guys?